Sophie here. So I have long wanted to get a traditional pencil style with grease pencil, but I wasn't able to find a way to do so until I started using the new stroke outline feature. So the first half of this video is all about setting up the brushes, how I create brushes for grease pencil from scratch. These brushes are also available to download for free. That is linked below. And so in the second part of the video, I will be using them to create this artwork. So let's get started. I've done a lot of experimenting with getting different traditional styles digitally. And so the main takeaway from my experiments is that it helps so much to use those real traditional textures that I'm trying to recreate. So I've been looking through these scans of pencil drawings that I made in 2019, both for inspiration for the piece that I'll be recreating digitally, but I am also on the lookout for textures that I can use to make brushes with. So I'll be making a few different types of pencil brushes, but the one that I'll start with will be a brush for making individual strokes. So with my scan open, I'll zoom in to 250%. And so I'm just looking for a texture that I think will work. For this first type of brush, I'm looking for areas of condensed pencil strokes, which I can turn into a fairly consistent repeating texture. And I am also on the lookout for straight lines, which will make making a repeating texture pretty easy. So once I've found an area of interest, I can screenshot it and I will open it up in Krita. I can press C and do a rough crop of the area that I want. And then with Control T, I will rotate it so that these straight lines that I want to use go up and down as exact as I can make it. Maybe I'll bring them close to the edge so I can compare against the straightness of the edge here. Nice. Then enter, and then I can press Control R. And what I do is I hold Shift while I drag over an area to get a square selection. And then with C and enter, I can crop to this area. So this is something that has come with time and practice and just making textures and then testing them out within Blender. And I do end up remaking or scrapping a lot of textures that just don't work out. But one thing that I'm always trying to avoid is having anything too noticeable in any of the corners, because that will just cause the repeating pattern to be really horribly obvious. So once I have this area I want, I can go into Filter, Adjust, and Desaturate it. And then I also want to go into Filter, Colors, and Color to Alpha, which gives this texture transparency. It gives the white of the background essentially full transparency. And then I want to press Control A to make sure everything is selected. And then I resize my canvas, multiplying both dimensions by 2. And I can pick any corner for this transformation to start from. I will invert my selection and delete to erase all of that white so that it's all transparent. And then Control A to select everything, copy paste. And then I want to transform the layer horizontally. I can do Control E to merge down, copy paste again, and transform the layer vertically. And this image is ready to be saved as a PNG with transparency. So some bonus settings, I'll Control E to merge down again so that everything is on one layer. So something I've noticed is that when adding textures to grease pencil, they often show up softer and a bit blurrier than the original texture images. So it may be interesting to experiment using the sharpen filter. And then if you'd like to darken a texture, what you can do is to duplicate that layer. And you can also modify the opacity of this duplicate to change just how much that you want to darken it. So it's pretty easy within Blender to make textures less opaque, but it's not as easy to make them more opaque. So sometimes it's just nice to go for a darker texture right off the bat. But now with my original texture, I will open up a brand new 2D animation workspace in Blender. I'll start by pressing N to bring up this menu and go into the tool. And here I want to open up the Materials Properties tab and create a new material slot and a new material. I don't want a stroke component, so I'll uncheck this box, but I do want to fill. and I want to change the style to texture, and here is where I can insert the texture that we just created. And then in draw mode, I can open up the stroke drop down, add an outline, and insert this new material into here. I will quickly name this. And then I do want to have a solid stroke material active for while I draw. So this is a material with just a stroke component, very straightforward, just a line type and a solid style. And let me do a few test strokes. I can resize my brush with F. All right. So then in my material settings of my pencil stroke material, there are definitely some changes that I want to make. I think the scale could be nice to be lowered. Cool. So I'm able to modify both scale values at once by just holding and dragging down and then modifying both of them. And then I also want the lines of the texture image to follow the direction of the strokes that I draw, which they don't currently do. So if I started with a texture with horizontal lines, they would already follow the stroke direction, but inserting a texture with vertical lines like we've done means that I need to give this texture a rotation value of 90. Oops. And yeah, I'm going to draw, and I am drawing with the fill material, and it's really not the same. So I want to have a solid stroke material be always active when I'm using this feature. So what I can do is I can select it, open up the brush settings drop down here, and pin the solid stroke material. Also note that in this brush settings drop down, we have the same stroke drop down as we had here. And if we go into the post-processing, we have the same outline feature that we can access, that we accessed here. And also keep in mind that these settings are all brush specific, and that setting this material for the stroke outline will set it only for this brush, not for any other brushes. And the same goes for pinning a material like we just did. So every stroke that we draw will start with the texture in the exact same position. So I also like to modify of my material the X and the Y location values. It's not quite as noticeable for this brush, but I do like for the start of each of my strokes to just have a look that I like, that I'm happy with. And then the blend value, if raised to 1, would have this material show up as whatever base color that we give it, resulting in a very fun colored pencil. And for limitless color, Blender 3.5 is incredible and allows you to use the vertex color palette with this feature. So I mostly use Blender 3.5 because that is amazing. But for this video, we're gonna see what we can do with just Blender 3.4 and having a black base color, making a black and white image essentially. So now, if you're looking to fill in an area very quickly with hatching, you may want to try turning a brush into a rake brush. So for this, I'll create a new material, select my pencil stroke, and duplicate it. And then I'll go into the Modifiers Properties tab and add an Array modifier. I'll have it influence only this new material and change the relative offset to a constant offset. In my brush settings, I will change the outline material to this new material duplicate, do some test strokes, and then I can raise the count and change the X as well as the Z distance location values. And just like that, I am getting multiple strokes with every single stroke. I've never used this. I don't see myself using it, but it always fascinated me, the thought of using this modifier with a stroke, and so I wanted to finally share it for once. Maybe someone will want to try this. So now that you know the general process, I did the same thing for all of my other brushes. I started by creating different opacity versions of this first type of brush that I've made, so both a lighter and a darker version. And then I wanted to make pattern brushes. So the idea here being that each stroke would contain multiple strokes within it, and these could be used on a larger scale to quickly fill in areas. So I was on the lookout for big areas of different kinds of stroke combinations that could make for interesting brushes. This is something that is just so hard to know how it will look until I test it out. So I went through a few versions, and what I do in this case is I'll bring one into Blender, make some test strokes with it, and then if I'm not happy with it, I can go on to make another one or modify that first one, and then I can just replace the texture of that material so that I already have strokes drawn, which gives me an instant look at whether or not I like this texture. So getting to the winners now, what I liked about this texture was the pattern that showed up at the start of all of the strokes, and I just thought that they layered on top of one another really nicely. Once I had this first texture that I liked, it was time to create a new material slot, select that initial material, duplicate it, and insert a new texture into this material. Then what I do is I select some of those initial strokes, and in edit mode, I can assign this new material to those strokes so that again, I'm very quickly getting to see how the texture looks. And then at 4 pattern brushes, I was really happy with the variety of texture options that I had to choose from, and I moved on to making smudge brushes. Because as a sweaty-handed individual, smudges are a big part of my pencil art. You may have noticed. Side note, it's kind of nice, really nice, to take this thing that used to upset me so much, like when I would smudge a pencil drawing, I would get so upset, to take that and turn it into an intentional part of my art was really cool. And so I always love when a texture starts from a blank space like this and transitions into opacity, because this allows me to have the start of the stroke be that blank space. And I just think it makes a really lovely fade in from transparency to opacity at the start of my strokes. So I really love the assortment of brushes that I've put together. The last thing I want to do is to make individual brushes so that switching materials can be as quick as possible. First, I wanted to make cover images for these brushes. So with Ctrl-Shift-S, I saved a new file, and then I changed my render size to 200 by 200 pixels, which in retrospect was on the big side, and maybe 150 by 150 would have been better. They do show up pretty small in the brush menu. But anyways, then I got rid of my background paper texture. And then to get a nice look for my cover images, I went into object mode and scaled up my grease pencil object with S. I moved it so that a blank space was showing up, and then I went at it, making cool designs for my cover images. I would press F12 to render and save them into a folder. And then I went back to my original file, and so to make individual brushes, what I do is I give a brush a certain outline material, I'll name it after that material, find the corresponding cover image here, then I press the 2 icon to duplicate it, and I can repeat that process for all of my materials. So a quick note about cover images. By experience, the connection between cover image and blend file will be lost if either the file or the brush folder is moved within your files. So by making a folder for the cover images, when things get inevitably moved, you can also move the folder to this new location, maybe duplicate the folder and move it there as well, and you can reconnect the images like this. Alright, time to get started making grease pencil art that looks like it was made with pencil. Hopefully. That's the goal anyway. So just a reminder that all of these brushes I made are free to download. They are linked below. And if you'd like to get a bit of bonus content and to help support me, I've also made available my final blend files and real-time videos of my process, both for this test piece and for the final piece that I made. These can be accessed for just a few dollars on my Gumroad or by becoming a patron. Any support goes a really long way. Thank you so much. So I selected a few sketches that are my personal favorites. I really like this sketchy, blocky style, and I also love hatching that fills out different sections of value. I then started with a test piece, and my takeaway was that although I want to make art inspired by my pencil drawings, the process of creating it isn't going to be the same as when I would make pencil art on paper. There is something that I love about making art with minimal tools, just traditional pencil strokes. I think it's a great learning tool, it's a lot of fun, but this kind of approach just really wasn't working, and so I decided that I needed to approach this in the same way as all of my other grease pencil art. So with that in mind, I wanted to start with my usual method for blocking in a piece. So I use my old leaky ink brush with a solid stroke material, and I make mostly straight lines to figure out all of the proportions. I'm blocking in shapes that I see within the body and not just drawing the outlines around it. I'm flipping my canvas to get a new perspective, keeping my reference image and my artwork quite small to make sure that I focus on my piece as a whole and not get lost in any small details. And I'm also using sculpt mode tools to move parts of my piece. Then, when I was ready to start incorporating the pencil brushes, I lowered the opacity of the solid stroke material so that my sketch would be faded. I did plan on removing all of the sketch lines eventually. So, to break the ice, I started by filling in a solid mass of value using my pattern 3 brush. Then I used the transform fill tool in edit mode to modify how this texture showed up within the stroke. I like having this option to be very precise about my fill textures, but I don't use it too often, and now you're seeing me just fill the body with values and with various different textures. Getting started is always intimidating, and so once I have a strong sketch that I'm happy with, I like to just throw strokes onto a canvas, throw textures and colors. The great thing about grease pencil is that I can fix anything that doesn't work later on. So this is a mindset that allows me to be free and playful at the start of a piece. And a quick note, because I'm using Blender 3.4 and all of these brushes have a black material color, I'm essentially just layering the textures on top of one another, and I'm getting darker and darker values. I'm not able to paint lighter values on top of them. It's an interesting challenge, and I mean, I think it mimics traditional pencil pretty accurately. In Blender 3.5, it would be possible to add lighter values if you use vertex colors. And so if you'd like to try this approach within Blender 3.5, you can do that by just not having vertex colors active in draw mode, or by using the darkest black vertex color and only that color. So my test piece also taught me that my darkest pencil material, I was still finding it too light, so I opened it up in Krita and I duplicated the layer and I saved it as a new version. I replaced that file in my material, and what I was focusing on now was to start defining the face. I saved a new version, because sometimes I mess things up and it's helpful to have previous save files to go back to. And then my process for animal art often goes something like starting with a sketch to figure out the proportions, then filling in the canvas with random textures, and then I start rendering the face. I'm not trying to get anything too rendered at this point, but with animal art, the face is where we have so much emotion and expression. It's such a powerful focal point. And so I like to make sure that it's working quite early on. And so typically, if the face makes me feel something when I look at it, then I know that I can make the whole piece work. Here, I was starting to test out not having any sketch strokes, and I did want to start deleting some, so I outlined the parts of my body that I hadn't started rendering yet. I then selected the solid stroke material, and I tested out trying to delete some of those strokes. I would then remove from my selection any strokes that I felt I still needed until I finally had a selection that I was comfortable deleting. These strokes that remain, I would go back and delete them a bit later on in the rendering process. So here's an example of fixing that I may do. I felt like this part of the foreleg was too dark, but I liked the texture in the rest of the stroke. So I set to changing the stroke shape in sculpt mode so that the texture would show up only where I wanted it to. Then I filled that section with a lighter texture. Here, you can see me use sculpt mode tools to get a more accurate shape of the mouth. And then I'm back to rendering the face. And at this point, I popped out a window to render into. I have that video explaining how I set this up, but this basically allows me to toggle back and forth between the changes that I've made in a drawing session. This helps me because sometimes things can get over-rendered and I start to lose a bit of carefree magic that my earlier works in progress had. For example, here, I was rendering the muzzle, and at one point I realized that I just much preferred what I had before. So in edit mode, I deleted a lot of those render strokes, and I ended up with something simpler than I started with, but I love it so much. I personally like to work in half-hour sprints, and in between each sprint, I take a break from my piece, so that when I return to it, I get a new perspective on it, and here I'm using that new perspective to fix the proportions. I also noticed that something just felt off. The white fur was feeling dirty, and so I thought that adding a dark background like the photo reference had would really help to make those white areas pop. Often, grease pencil strokes have a pretty obvious shape to them, obvious edges, and the best way that I found to make this less obvious is to layer a lot of strokes on top of one another, to vary the types of textures that I use, and like I talked about earlier in the video, to make use of textured strokes that start from transparency and blend into opacity. And then, after this, about an hour of rendering ensued from here to getting it to the final piece. So the finalizing is just a mishmash of all of the techniques that I've talked about so far, from modifying individual strokes in edit mode and sculpt mode, to adding and deleting strokes. And as for when to call a piece finished, so I usually reach a point where I think this is getting there. I would be not embarrassed to share this piece on social media and to call it done, but then I don't. Then I like to let it sit for at least a day, and when I come back to it, I do another half hour or hour of work. At the start of this final sprint, I did any proportion fixes that I still noticed, but pretty quickly, I started finalizing the piece without really looking at the reference image. I felt like I had built a really strong foundation based on this real animal photo, and that now allowed me to make stylistic choices and to make changes based on what I thought would make for the nicest standalone artwork. So here's a look at what I changed in that last half hour, and a little scroll through of my process. And finally, in my opinion, nothing helps sell that illusion quite like a paper texture background. The start of this video explains how I set that up in Blender. And finally, here is my final piece, made entirely with my grease pencil style brushes. So these brushes are free to download, and for just a few dollars you can access my artwork blend files and have access to real-time videos of my process. Patrons also have access to all of this. Also, if seeing my process interests you, on my Patreon I do monthly Create With Me videos where I talk through my entire process in real time and share all of the blend files for creating a piece. So thank you so much for watching. I hope that this was helpful. You can find me all over the internet at SophieJanTech. Feel free to tag me if you use my brushes. I would absolutely love to see and to share that. I will see you very soon. Take care. Bye.